Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 32 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, which the Sharks have lost 4-1. And just a couple of days ago, the Sharks faced off against the Colorado Avalanche and lost by a score of 6-2, and yet in my review for that game, I mentioned how it was a bit closer than it would have appeared on the scoreboard due to some very good chances for the San Jose Sharks. They could have potentially closed in on that deficit and perhaps even forced an overtime with a bit more puck luck, but at the end of the day, because that they didn't get the bounces, they end up losing it 6-2, but it's not nearly as lopsided as it may have seemed. Here tonight, the Sharks drop it 4-1 to the Los Angeles Kings, and it is actually quite the opposite, where a 3-goal deficit, especially with one of them being into the empty net, may not look that bad, but in fact, the Sharks were heavily outplayed here tonight, and yet, I'm not necessarily super disappointed with the Sharks' performance. This doesn't feel like one of those games back in the earlier parts of the season where they just get absolutely destroyed and the Sharks just don't even look like though they bothered to show up for the game. The fact of the matter is that yes, sometimes you're going to lose games because your team didn't show up, your team played exceptionally bad, but sometimes you're going to lose games not because your team played all that terribly, but because the other team is just that much better than you. And it felt as though that was indeed the case here tonight. The Los Angeles Kings just looked so much faster than the San Jose Sharks, and not necessarily in the sense of, oh, well, they skated faster, but also faster mentally. It felt as though the Sharks were always a couple of steps behind the Los Angeles Kings. For sure, there were stretches of this game where the Sharks were indeed shooting themselves in the foot with terrible defensive zone and neutral zone giveaways, which allowed the Kings to rack up more shots than they probably should have had. But there were also stretches of this game where the Sharks didn't look all that terribly, but were still just the worst team on a consistent basis here tonight, and that is why they put up pretty much 0 shots, it feels like, through the entirety of these 60 minutes. And so when we come into this actual game, the first period, the Sharks are indeed outplayed, but they get a couple of chances for themselves, unfortunately unable to convert, and it's instead Kopitar on the power play who makes it 1-0 Los Angeles. Come second period, the Sharks get pretty much nothing generated in this one, and the Kings add to their lead and further pad it as well to make it 3-0 for themselves pretty quickly. Then we get to the third period. This is where the Sharks open up the game a bit and start to get some decent chances. We saw one get swept away from the goal line by a Kings defenseman just a couple of minutes into this period. Had the Sharks actually scored that, perhaps it could have gone somewhat differently if we could have seen some of that Sharks comeback magic, but because that doesn't end up happening, the Sharks, they never really get a foothold in this game, and eventually, with about 3 minutes to go, the Sharks do get a power play. David Quinn does feel empowered to pull the goaltender for a 6-on-4 situation, but unfortunately, it is Anthony Duclair drawing back into the lineup after the healthy scratch who gives the puck away and allows the Kings to make it 4-0. Jacob McDonald does ruin the shutout about a minute later to at least make this look somewhat respectable on the scoreboard, but at the end of the day, the Sharks do indeed lose it 4-1 to the Kings. And like I said, this just really felt as though this was a game in which the Sharks were just not as good as Los Angeles, and there's just sometimes not much you can do about that. When it comes to the players to talk about, there isn't necessarily a ton of interesting things to say. As I mentioned, because the Sharks were so heavily outplayed here tonight, most of these players didn't necessarily look all that great, but unlike in some of the games in the earlier parts of the season where it didn't necessarily bear any value to discuss how they performed, I felt as though I'll at least do a somewhat quick review of how these players did play. And let us start off with the first line of Eklund, Hertl, and Barabanov. Now, first things first, with Duclair coming back into the lineup, Barabanov finds himself back onto the top line, hoping to make some sort of impact here, but not only does he do very little in this actual game, but David Quinn ends up actually demoting him down to the third line come the third period of this one, and so you can tell that David Quinn's patience with Alexander Barabanov is indeed running thin, and I wonder if he may very well be that next healthy scratch type of player from the top 6 for the San Jose Sharks, because when you're playing with Eklund and Hertl, you're hoping to be able to complement them, and he should be able to do so, but he's just not really having his head in the game at this point, and so he's not helping the two other line mates here at all. When it comes to both Eklund and Hertl, they had a couple of decent offensive zone shifts, but it felt as though they were just heavily stifled by a very, very strong defensive Los Angeles Kings team. In fact, the best best defensive team in the entire league thus far this season, and without a third line mate to perhaps bounce off of a bit, nothing could ever really get generated by this top line. When it comes to the second line, we have Zetterlund, Granlund, and Duclair. Like I mentioned, Duclair drawing back into the lineup, and it was a bit of a rough game for him. He does very, very little, and he kind of ends off his performance on the night with that terrible giveaway that led to the empty net goal that really put this game away. And so that's not going to look particularly good if you're David Quinn watching this one, because it is indeed the last thing that you see from him. And when it comes to generally working in the offensive zone, as I had mentioned in many previous games, this is not exactly a line that's going to be forechecking hard and pushing the pace and pressuring defensemen in the offensive zone. It's a line that's going to stretch out the ice and get those rush type of chances. But when you are indeed against the best defensive team in the league, like the Los Angeles Kings are, the rush chances are going to be very few and far between. I believe they had only one chance in this entire game off of the rush, so to speak, which I think it was Zetterlund with the opportunity, who was unable to score on Rittich. But otherwise, not really much doing. Granlund didn't really get the shine as he has been over these past couple of weeks, and so the second line, pretty bad. When it comes to the third line here, we have Bailey with Cunnin and Hoffman. So Bailey dropped from the first line in favor of Duclair coming back, comes back to the third line. This third line, not great. The one player who I would say did stand out in a positive light was actually Mike Hoffman. I did appreciate Hoffman's performance here tonight. He made a few good plays, some nice offensive zone time, even getting back defensively with some strong back checks at times in this one. So he was the bright spot on this third line. The other two players, Bailey and Cunnin, they had a couple of moments, but really nothing doing there, stifled heavily by the Kings. And so Hoffman just kind of was the only real standout performer on this third line, which didn't really end up leading to much. Then we get to the Sharks' fourth line, and in the previous game against the Colorado Avalanche, I mentioned how because McDonald left that one so early due to the major penalty and game misconduct given against him, it was essentially just Labanc and Zadina playing with a rotating cast of players as the third man on that trio, and both Labanc and Zadina, while individually pretty good, never really combined to make an actual cohesive line. Here tonight, while I do think that kind of was similar, they did definitely look more cohesive here tonight with an actual center playing with them at a consistent basis, that being Studnicka. Now, Studnicka, I felt as though was the weakest player on this fourth line. While he came exceptionally close to scoring, he was the one who had that opportunity in the early parts of the third period that had to be swept right off of the goal line by that Kings defenseman. Besides that, Studnicka not really doing much of anything or really showing any sort of offensive flair to his game. And especially when you're playing on the fourth line with both Labanc and Zadina, two players who do have that offensive flair and are hoping to make some chances happen, it's not exactly a great choice of sort of combinations here, but I guess it worked out decently well because I thought both Labanc and Zadina had a good amount of energy in their games here tonight. Individually looked quite solid, had some decent passes between them as well, and were some of the better forwards for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, even if that's not saying much. From a defensive standpoint, we have Ferraro and Burrows, and this was definitely an off night, I would say, particularly for Kyle Burrows. I mean, I can't exactly describe it as an off night because it's not as though these two players are necessarily super high flying as usual and this was just like a small bump in the road. They're frequently packed into the defensive zone. They're frequently finding themselves defending about 85% of the time, and that was indeed the case here tonight, but it just felt as though things were slightly more off. Ferraro, I thought, had a couple of good and clean defensive plays where he was able to save goals multiple times, but the fact is the reason he was put into a position to have to try and save those goals is because he's previously not actually getting those strong defensive moves to be able to take pucks away, to be able to pressure Kings players, to force the giveaways that the Kings themselves were doing to the San Jose Sharks in their defensive zone. And so this top top defensive pairing. Not so great for San Jose, but it's not as though it's really going to ever be all that great. Then we have the second pairing. So, of course, there were 2 substitutions on the defensive side for the San Jose Sharks. Calen Addison out with an injury, Jan Rutta out with an illness, and so 2 new players-ish step into the lineup. One new, one just sort of switches back to his original position. That is Vlasic coming in, as well as McDonald moving from forward to defense. And so the second defensive pairing now becomes Henry Thrun, previously playing with Calen Addison, and Nikita Okhotyuk, previously playing with Jan Rutta. And this was an extremely rough-looking defensive pairing, especially in the early parts of the game. Now, like I mentioned in I believe the previous one, when it comes to both Thrun and Calen Addison, while they can look pretty decent for about 80% of the time, there are just a few shifts where just everything that possibly could go wrong does go wrong, and that was absolutely the case for these 2 players once again. I believe it was Okhotyuk's second or third shift of the game where he gave the puck away, I counted in about 30 seconds, 4 different times, and you may be thinking, oh, well, he doesn't have 4 giveaways from like the NHL official stats page. Yes, that's true, but that's mostly because the NHL is very strict about what the definition of a giveaway is for them, while I am exceptionally more lenient in that, right? For the NHL, if you don't pass the puck straight to a Kings player, or have it completely just stripped off of your stick by a Kings player, then it's not a giveaway. But for me, if you, let's say, are holding the puck along the boards, someone comes in to pressure you and you're unable to get rid of the puck before they are able to win that battle and take it away, that to me is a giveaway. Or if you try to make a pass to a Sharks player, but the pass is way too far behind them, it goes to some empty ice and a Kings player is able to skate right into it, that is also a giveaway. And so on that particular shift, like I said, the second or third shift of the game, he gave the puck away so many times that it was just an absolute train wreck of a defensive zone shift for Okhotyuk, and it's just general theme for him, as it has been for the entirety of this season thus far. From an all-around 60-minute standpoint, he's really not all that terrible, but there are just way too many shifts where he's just constantly making the worst possible play, and it is costing the San Jose Sharks some goals against, a lot of goals against. In fact, you look back at some of the goals that the Sharks have given up over these past few weeks, and a lot of the times it is strictly because of Okhotyuk either giving a puck away or having poor defensive positioning in front of the net and not tying up a stick. When it comes to Henry Thrun, it's been a nice and fun experiment with him being called up here from the San Jose Barracuda, and he certainly has had some moments where he has shined and looked pretty good, but a lot more moments where it's just poor puck management, which I have highlighted multiple times in his last few games. The Sharks' defense is so shorthanded with the injuries to Emberson, Benning, Rutta, and Calen Addison that you don't really have any other option than to continue to play Henry Thrun, and I don't necessarily have much of an issue with that, but I imagine once the Sharks' defense does get healthy, Thrun may very well be the odd man out immediately. And then we have the third defensive pairing of McDonald and Vlasic. These guys didn't necessarily get to play a ton of ice time here tonight, but when they did, they were not particularly good. Vlasic really just disastrous in front of the net as well. I mean, he was unable to really pick up Laferriere. 5 years ago, Marc-Edouard Vlasic is there before even Laferriere recognizes that he can go in front of the net to tip that puck. Now, 5 years later, in the present time, it is Vlasic who is a couple of steps behind. That's just the general theme of Vlasic's game over these past few years, where he has fallen so far from grace, and so it's generally not a surprise, as per usual, to see him play poorly. And then finally, we have the goaltender Kaapo Kähkönen. It was a bit of an up and down game. I thought he made a lot of very, very good saves, and he didn't have much of a chance on either the Kopitar or the Laferriere goal, but the Trevor Moore one, he certainly could have had. But then again, a lot of shots here for the Kings. He only let in 3 goals against on a manned net, and so it was actually a relatively positive game, and he was one of the better players for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the Arizona Coyotes again. It was just a few days ago where they got shut out 1-0 because their 2 goals that they did score ended up getting called off on a coach's challenge, and so we'll see if the Sharks have a bit of better luck in that one. Class dismissed.